Hello everyone. Today I will be addressing Paul Cockshott's most recent videos on the LGBT community as well as his article on the same subject. My original response was an unscripted live reaction, however, after going back and revisiting it, let's just say I don't think it was up to standard, so I've taken the liberty of sitting down and planning a more intelligent and well thought out response in kind. In Cockshott's original video titled Political Economy of Gay and Lesbian Households, along with a follow-up video titled A Fake Left, he presents a number of fact claims and mathematical statistics to support the following conclusions. Number 1. The majority of the LGBT community constitutes a non-exploited professional middle class with little to no revolutionary potential. Number 2. Gay and lesbian households, by virtue of having fewer children on average than do heterosexual households, are in effect foregoing their social responsibility to child rearing and domestic labor. Number 3. To compensate for gay and lesbians' shirking of domestic labor, a draconian bachelor tax should be introduced, modeled after a similar tax policy implemented by Khrushchev in the Soviet Union after World War II. Number 4. That support for the struggle for LGBT liberation is a non-revolutionary struggle since apparently it is supported by the powers that be. Number 5. That although socialists should support legal equality for the LGBT community, that due to its middle-class base, that they should not be allowed to influence the movement's policies or ideology, and that their issues should be treated as a secondary concern rather than a priority. Number 6. That since some LGBT activist groups and organizations have been historically supported by the CIA, that LGBT activism at large is being used as a psyop on the part of the capitalist class to subvert the left and by extension create a new left which is pro-status quo and non-revolutionary in nature. Number 7. That the historical repression and criminalization of LGBT activist groups under both previously and currently existing socialist projects including the USSR, China, and North Korea is in fact justified on the grounds that all the aforementioned LGBT political orgs are subversive and/or CIA. These are the main arguments that he's posing that I plan on addressing in detail. But first, I want to make a few quick points surrounding identity politics and intersectionality. All intersectionality states is that many of these struggles, from Black Lives Matter to the modern feminist movement to LGBTQ and so on, are all interlinked and intersect with one another at times. It is possible, for example, for say a trans woman to experience both transphobia and misogyny at the same time. That's what we call transmisogyny. Another example includes the treatment of black and brown men by the police and the prison industrial complex. Black and brown men are statistically more prone to be profiled, harassed, and arrested by the police. And if they go to jail, if they can't pay their bail, then they're stuck serving a longer sentence. This is a very real manifestation of how classism and racism intersect. And as socialists, while it is of utmost importance that the class struggle is prioritized, we can't just sit here and pretend that these other issues aren't also fundamentally interlinked with the struggle for workers' emancipation on some level. Especially here in the United States, where the black community are quite literally a stolen people who continue to struggle under the ongoing legacies of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, white supremacy, and discrimination. Or the First Nations communities in this country, whom have had all of their land and wealth stolen from them and are to this day victims of an ongoing genocide. And in regards to the LGBT movement, there are a number of reasons why we as socialists should absolutely stand in solidarity with and be supporters of LGBT liberation. And it's the same reason why we should absolutely be in favor of feminism, black and indigenous liberation as well. The reasons are as follows. Number 1. It's a fantastic litmus test to see who is a comrade and who is a reactionary, as being pro-LGBT rights is a relatively low bar to pass for even the most moderate of left-wingers. Number 2. How does it make any sense to be an advocate for workers' rights and an advocate for the ultimate liberation of humanity while at the same time being either aloof to or against the support of people's liberation on sociological grounds? How is it that one can be a socialist without also being a feminist, or being pro-decolonization, or being anti-gay? It simply doesn't work. The communist movement, since its inception, has been the most progressively liberatory force that humankind has ever known. And whenever the workers' movement has gotten hung up on not supporting these issues, it has always been to the detriment of the movement and to the benefit of the bourgeoisie. From the white workers' trade unions upholding segregation, to the Black Panthers initially being a men's-only club, to the eschewing of gay rights by Fidel Castro in Cuba, etc. And on that point, many so-called Marxists will dogmatically point to these prior socialist projects and the fact that they've engaged in these socially conservative policies as evidence that we should be following in their footsteps. In doing so, they throw all materialism out the window, ignoring the fact that these countries were a product of their time and that being a critical supporter doesn't mean you have to agree with literally every single thing that they've ever done. Number 3. It is much easier to convince people in general that bigotry is bad as compared to convincing them that capitalism is bad, which is why it is to our advantage to begin by working from the former position, that is, bigotry is bad, and then from there using it as a springboard to bounce people towards the latter position, that is, that capitalism is bad. For this reason, it is incredibly easy to build pipelines stemming from the feminist movement, Black Lives Matter, and the LGBT movement towards a socialist movement, as many of my best comrades are queer, women, and people of color whom were radicalized through such means. And so, if you want to be exclusionary of these people and their issues on the grounds that we are being woke in doing so, be my guest, but you're only leaving large swaths of the working population out to dry. Which brings me to my 4th point. Number 4. You're leaving out large swaths of the working population out of the movement. Not only are you losing out on tons of potential comrades, not only are you alienating members of these oppressed minorities by ignoring and/or eschewing their issues, you are also alienating large swaths of the general working population that aren't even members of these communities because increasingly so, people are more conscientious of bigotry than ever before. And they will pick up on your reactionary prejudice and want nothing to do with you sooner or later. Furthermore, it's important to understand that the right is always going to try to co-opt us, which is why educating people is of utmost priority as to inoculate them against the bullshit. But according to Paul Cockshott, because the bourgeoisie is already trying to subvert the struggle for queer liberation, we should therefore by extension not even bother prioritizing their issues, as though queer folk are only a recent manifestation of ruling class decadence and not a community of people whom have existed across the world as long as people have existed. Here's a comment which Cockshott hearted with positive approval, meaning he is on some level agreeing with this sentiment, and I quote, "Acceptance of homosexuality and other sexual identities seems to coincide with the creation of new markets. Modern sexual identities are just consumer brands. Being 2SL LGBTQ+ is no different than being an MCU fan. Both identities are actualized through the purchase of commodities. The only reason why trans is a thing is because the medical industrial complex exists and has ideological factories that are so effective that they were able to convince a significant section of the population that men can become women if they blast their endocrine system with exogenous estrogen and wear a dress. State-subsidized breast implants for men and double mastectomies for emotionally disturbed preteen girls are considered human rights issues. Expressing any level of dissent to anything LGBTQ will often result in public condemnation and humiliation, followed by a loss of a job or destruction of a small business. LGBTQ, especially the T, is extremely effective as a mechanism for disciplining the working class. LGBT members themselves are the ideological and actual shock troops of capital. It is a deadly alliance of lumpen proles and bourgeoisie." Unquote. If Cockshott lauding this comment with approval doesn't very clearly and obviously telegraph his queerphobia, I don't know what does. And with respect to this comment, I don't even know where to begin explaining everything wrong with it, besides re-edifying the fact that queerness has been a part of the human condition for as long as there have been humans on this planet. And for two, it's not even unique to the human condition either. Plenty of other complex life forms in the animal kingdom have engaged in sexual activities with members of the same sex, along with swapping gender roles with the opposite sex as well.
As many in 1 in 10 rams can be gay and will live exclusively gay lives with only male partners, even with fertile females around.
It's not just sheep. More than 450 vertebrates and more than 1,500 species overall engage in homosexual acts aplenty.
Beetles, birds, bonobos, bats,
Dolphins, orangutans, macaques, and penguins.
dragonflies, albatross, dogs and cats, even lions all exhibit homosexual behavior. And king, males grow manes while females remain sleek. Mamoreri lives in Botswana, and though this lion has a mane, she ain't a lion, she's a lioness. with the gender expression of a male lion. And it's pretty intense. She's roaring, she's mounting other lionesses. Clownfish are a common aquatic example of transgender animals, but they don't just change expression, they also are able to spawn and carry offspring because they change sex. All the little Nemos are actually male-presenting hermaphrodites. Another example is the marsh harrier, a Euro-African bird of prey. The males are brown, ginger, and gray with black wingtips, but not always. And in fact, 40% of males look and act like the chocolate brown, yellow-crowned females of the species.
So no, Mr. Cody Edwards, you ignorant fuck. Queerness is not a manifestation of bourgeois decadence. It is an inherent part of both the human condition and life itself. And the oppression and discrimination that they face is very much real and material, regardless of however much the ruling class might virtue signal support. And mind you, all of what I'm about to say here today is coming from the lens of a general supporter of Cockshott and his works. Paul Cockshott is both a brilliant computer scientist and political economist who has made some invaluable contributions to the realm of Marxist and socialist theory. So the fact that he is either unwilling or incapable of heeding the criticisms of his peers and recognizing that he might have some underlying prejudices that he may need to correct, and is instead choosing to double down and die on this incredibly divisive and ignorant hill, in effect sacrificing his own reputation on the altar of queerphobia, is a damn shame. It's a damn shame, because the guy is brilliant enough to design a valid computerized global socio-economic model capable of solving all of the major challenges facing humanity, and monitoring, measuring, and calculating hundreds of millions of material inputs and outputs in real time, but he can't take a moment to listen to his peers, engage in self-criticism, and get with the fucking times on the question of the LGBT? Regardless, with respect to the main points raised earlier, I'm going to take some time to thoroughly address his criticisms and concerns, and provide rebuttals of my own.
Into the sociological studies, you'll find there's plenty of sociological data showing higher proportions of homosexuals are in the professional classes. If you look at attributes like having a university degree, in the UK the ratio is 36 to 16. If it comes to having professional jobs, it's 9 to 5. If you look at the US, where the issue is having a college degree, the ratio is 43% to 27%. So, fairly consistent 2-to-1 ratio in these areas.
This is my first issue with the video. Cockshott is using a liberal definition of class, defining the term on grounds of income and not by one's relationship to the means of production. This is a minor point, but as Marxists, how much earnings that you make doesn't matter to us as much as how you make your earnings. So you could have two people making $80K per year. But if one of them is an engineer exchanging their labor time for a wage, and the other is a landlord collecting rent payments from their tenants, it cannot be argued that the class composition of both individuals are the same. The reason why the middle class has historically been non-revolutionary is due to the fact that they're typically earning enough money to be able to buy a house, own property, pay off their vehicle, have a 401k, and invest in the stock market. And it's not uncommon for high-wage workers to have assets and equity tied up with the current system, which is why more often than not, these people tend to not want to overthrow it, but rather reform it. Granddaddy Marx once said, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." Well, as it turns out, first world workers with high incomes tend to have something more to lose besides their chains. The truth is that revolutionary activity causes the stock market to take a dive, and when the stock market takes a dive, so too does the value of their assets. And so even though the first world middle class lifestyle is, at least in my opinion, extremely overrated and not all that it's cut out to be, even though socialism could provide a better quality of life for the people at the higher end of the wage bell curve, many simply do not want to put what little equity that they have on the line on the grounds that a better alternative may possibly exist. With that being said, we shouldn't simply rule people out of the movement on the grounds of high income alone, because even among the middle class, precarity is increasingly common in their ranks. As in the wake of the 2020 crisis, record numbers of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, even including among those who make up to $250,000 per year. Plus, need I remind you that many of the most important thought leaders and revolutionaries within the communist movement came from middle-class origins. Engels was a manager and financier underneath his father's textile business. Lenin was a lawyer and the descendant of well-off aristocrats. Mao hailed from a rich peasant's family and was better off than most during his day. Che Guevara and Fidel Castro both had middle-class origins. Kim Il-sung and Ho Chi Minh were by no means destitute during their respective upbringings. And all of these men, mind you, never had to pursue the strenuous, clandestine, and oftentimes deadly lifestyles of being a revolutionary. All of them had more promising and profitable futures cut out for them, but they instead had foregone such opportunities at a comfortable life in favor of one of perpetual self-sacrifice and devotion to a cause greater than themselves.
Once you adjust for the per capita income, that's to say, if you divide the household income by the mean household size, you find that the tendency goes from gay couples have the most household income, then per capita, then lesbian couples, then straight couples. Gay men on average earn more than married men, lesbians earn more than married women. Both of these groups have a higher activity rate, therefore that's to say a higher percentage of them are actually working. If you multiply the activity rate by the mean pay rate, you get the per couple pay rate. And if you scale that by family size, you get the same result as in Sweden, that the ratio goes gay couples, lesbian couples.
In both of these segments, Cockshott is showcasing aggregate earnings of gay and lesbian households in Britain and in Sweden as compared to heterosexual households per capita income. There's a reason for this too. As I discussed in the original live stream on the topic, gay men tend to be overrepresented in college graduates and degreed workers. Quote, recent news about the significant shift of women outpacing men in attending college, now a 60-40 ratio, overlooks one of the highest achieving groups of all, gay men. Middleman found that gay men's academic success doesn't just subtly outshine straight men. Roughly 52% of gay men in the US have a bachelor's degree, while the overall national number for all adults in the US is 36%. 6% of gay men in the US have an advanced degree, which is about 50% higher than that of straight men. With such clear academic advantage and disadvantages now understood by his study, Middleman also sought to understand why certain groups excel over others. Drawing from Andrew Tobias's memoir, The Best Little Boy in the World, this hypothesis proposes that gay men respond to societal homophobia by overcompensating in achievement-related domains. Reflecting on this possibility, Middleman suggests that academic performance offers an accessible domain of competitive self-mastery. Whereas the rules of masculinity may feel obscure or unattainable, the rules of school can feel discreet and manageable. Whereas the approval of a parent may be uncertain, the praise of a teacher can be regularly earned with the right amount of effort. And when other avenues of being a man are cut off, pursuing the kinds of prestigious careers made possible through meticulously high achievement offers a way to shore up one's standing as a man. Another reason why gay men tend to excel in college could also have to do with the fact that many people go through most, if not all of their lives, not even knowing that they're gay or pansexual, and oftentimes they usually only find out through social interactions with other gay or pansexual men and women. Well, as it turns out, there tends to be a strong LGBT presence and support for the LGBT at your average institution of higher learning. Within such an environment, it shouldn't be that surprising why more men and women would be out of the closets. But regardless, let's grant him that what he's presenting here is true, that gay and lesbian households bring home a higher per average income per capita. Even if this were true, the argument surrounding gay rights has always been grounded in the realm of discrimination and social stigma. That is fundamentally what the issue is here, and so whether or not gay and lesbian couples have greater earnings is completely irrelevant to the overall question of LGBT liberation. As we have established earlier, income does not equal class. Even if you could show me statistical evidence that gay and lesbian couples not only earn more money, and that the source of that additional income was through exploitation, there would still be no solid case that could be made that there is some kind of inherent bourgeois or middle-class nature to the LGBT community. Even if such a correlation could be drawn, it still wouldn't matter. Nazis often argue the case that Jews constitute a ruling elite and point to the fact that Jews are overrepresented in demographics among the investors and bankers to justify their anti-Semitism. Does the fact that Jews tend to occupy high-skilled professions and positions of finance prove that Jewish people don't experience anti-Semitism? Of course not. And this is the problem with taking statistical averages about groups and using them to extrapolate conclusions about individuals. And to further illustrate this point, I shall now present a litany of statistics proving without a shadow of a doubt that the LGBT community not only faces real discrimination and oppression, but that LGBT peoples are also not nearly as economically advantaged as Cockshott makes them out to be. Whilst it may be true that there's a disproportionate number of degreed homosexual men relative to the general population, when one looks in the aggregate, the LGBT community as a whole fares worse with respect to earnings relative to the cis-hetero population. Here's some excerpts from a BBC article on the subject. Quote, "A decade after graduation, college-educated workers in the US who self-identify as LGBTQ earn 22% less than their heterosexual cisgender counterparts, according to preliminary findings published in the Social Science Research Network in April 2022. A year after graduation, the earnings gap was 12%, meaning the figure almost doubles within a decade, with a range of forces responsible for deepening the disparity over time. Overall, these discrepancies are nuanced. In early 2022, the LGBTQ advocacy group HRC Foundation found that LGBTQ workers earn about 90 cents for every dollar earned by typical heterosexual US workers. This gap is felt more starkly by LGBTQ people of color, transgender women, and men and non-binary people. LGBTQ Native American workers, for example, earn 70 cents for every dollar earned by a typical worker. A global meta-analysis from 2014 found that on average, gay men earned 11% less than heterosexual men, lesbian women earned 9% more than heterosexual women, a premium that can be attributed to the income hit that many women take when they have children, rather than a lack of discrimination. In another report recently published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, median earnings for LGBT workers has been found to be 90 cents on the dollar of cis-hetero workers. This is an important point because Cockshott's narrative of LGBT people constituting a well-paid professional middle class hinges on a very forced and selective interpretation of the data, which involves looking at singular facts in a vacuum without accounting for other variables. And so while gay men might be overrepresented among college graduates, the aggregate of the LGBT community is demonstrably poorer and worse off than the general population from an economic standpoint. Furthermore, there are still many countries out there in which being queer is a crime or even a death sentence. Depending on where you live, you could get beaten up, you could be robbed, sent to prison, sent to a psych ward, be forcibly sterilized, undergo forced gender reassignment surgery, or even be outright murdered for the crime of being what you are. And these tendencies don't stop with the second and third world either. Queerphobia is very much alive and well here in the United States, as anti-sodomy laws prohibit homosexual activity across the country, from Alabama to Florida to Idaho to Kansas to Louisiana to Michigan to Mississippi to South Carolina to Texas to Utah and so on. At this time, Republicans are actively working to circumvent the codification of gay marriage into federal law. Trans people routinely face discrimination from their healthcare providers, as anecdote after anecdote reveals how they are constantly being denied healthcare services, being denied treatment for their dysphoria, being subjected to harassment by hospital staff, or being located in an area of the country where no such treatment is available. And if, God forbid, you are a trans woman of color, you are basically a walking target for bullying, sexual assault, rape, and murder, as the rates of violent crime and harassment directed towards trans women of color are absolutely rampant. LGBT people are also victims of homelessness at elevated rates compared to the cis-hetero population, since queer kids and teenagers are more often than not disowned and cast out by their own family members for simply being what they are. According to data from nationalhomelessness.org, 40% of homeless youth served by homeless charities and soup kitchens are LGBT. 43% of clients served by drop-in centers are LGBT, and 30% of street outreach clients and clients utilizing housing programs identify as LGBT as well. And under some instances, some homeless shelters and soup kitchens are discriminatory towards homeless LGBT people, actively turning them away with signs on their front doors telling them that they're not allowed in. And with the recent repealing of Roe v. Wade, a foundational ruling upon which loads of civil rights legislation, legal protections, and entitlements to the LGBT community are foundationally based upon, we can all but count on reactionaries at the state level repealing and taking the torch to what little progressive policy that the LGBT community might have in place. I bring all this up because, again, Though large corporations might fly rainbow flags, though the CIA might funnel money into LGBT front groups, and though politicians may pay lip service to the LGBT community, the fact of the matter is that the discrimination and oppression that they face is very much real and very much an issue that we as socialists need to take seriously regardless of whether or not it has ruling class support. As socialists, we should realize that this support by the capitalists is paper thin, and that it is all being done in an effort for them to make money off of and to neutralize the revolutionary components of the struggle. Capitalism is inherently subversive like this, and it is our job to combat this subversion, rather than cherry-picking statistics to justify the conspiratorial conclusion that the entire rainbow movement is a middle-class glow-up.
This is a consistent result. This relative order arises because, as I said before, gay couples only exceptionally have dependent children. If you don't believe this, check census data. Men are paying more than women, and graduates are paying more than non-graduates. These three factors combine to produce that result. Now, what these results show is that there's a 2-to-1 advantage in per capita income for gay as opposed to straight couples. Now, what does that amount to?
Because homosexual couples can't get accidentally pregnant, combined with the actually existing social stigma around children being raised by gay parents, the result is that gay households have very few to no children, and according to most statistics that I've looked at, the total cost of raising a child averages around $200,000 to $250,000 spread out over the course of an 18-year time period. This means that a household with 2 dependents will, by design, have close to $500,000 less earnings over the course of their lifetimes when compared to a household with 0 dependents. And so Cockshott derives his figures by comparing the average heterosexual household, which typically do have dependents, to the average homosexual household, which by his own admission typically have few to 0 dependents. However, Cockshott makes a critical error here. He leaves heterosexual couples without children out of the equation.
If you combine it with the distribution of wages by deciles in Britain, you find that only the top 10% of straight couples are as well off as a mid-income gay couple, a median income gay couple.
But where are the figures for straight couples without children, Cockshott? You're leaving out the information on straight couples without children. The reason why this is important is because you could derive a similar statistical advantage for heterosexual couples without dependents when compared to heterosexual couples with dependents. Naturally, if the average family has 2 children, the household without said children are going to have several $100,000 more of disposable income on the table over the course of their lifetimes. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars which can be spent on a new car, on a new summer home, on vacations, and on investments in property or financial equity. And so everything Cockshott is saying about gays could just as easily be said about straight couples without children.
Well, you can look at the wage share in Britain. This is the trend of the wage share. If we take the year in which that sample data, the survey data I've been quoting comes from, which is 2005, the wage share is 53%. If you have an income per capita equal to twice the average wage, then the living standard is not that of the family that is exploited. You're in the ranks of the non-exploited middle class. Because if we assume 50-50 division of value created between labour and capital, if you're twice the median, the mean position, you're in a non-exploited position. That's it.
So homosexuals aren't exploited because on average they have greater earnings and have fewer children. I'm sorry, but this is straight up dishonest statistical fuckery. The rate of exploitation has nothing to do with income earnings and everything to do with the difference between the reproduction cost of the worker and the revenue generated by the firm. Cockshott himself, in a previous video titled On Unequal Exchange, has pointed out how due to labor productivity in the first world being so much higher than it is in the third world, that the rate of exploitation is also exponentially higher in the first world workers as well. Farmers in Canada and the United States produce exponentially greater outputs when compared to farmers in India. And so despite the fact that the first world farmer might be getting paid more, because they're also producing so much more, the ratio of their wages to unpaid labor is substantially higher as well. Even if the worker is a high-skilled professional who makes an $80K a year salary, that is the reproduction cost of that worker. because that person had to spend tens of thousands of dollars on going to school and thousands upon thousands of hours in training to develop that skill set that is in short supply but in high demand. Income earnings alone have little to nothing to do with it, and neither does the number of dependents. Having a dependent does not equate to raising the rate of exploitation just because that person has to spend more money taking care of that child. Next up, Cockshott calculates the amount of unpaid, socially necessary unpaid labor time in the domestic economy contributed by gay, lesbian, and heterosexual households as to facilitate his next point that gay and lesbian couples are shirking their social responsibility.
We find that the amount of socially necessary labour time that was unpaid, what it would be worth, according to the monetary equivalent of labour time, ranks this way: 27,000 for the straight couple, 2,300 for the gay couple. Note that this is more than the per capita income of a straight couple. The socially necessary labour time performed in the domestic economy is more than the per capita income earned as wage labour. From the standpoint of society as a whole, the gay couple were shirking their social labour to the tune of 27,000. Which, as I say, is more than the per capita income of the average household.
Again, the exact same argument could be made against straight couples who don't have any kids, which according to the Census Bureau is at an all-time low. Quote, the share of adults living without children has climbed 19 points since 1967 to 71.3%. The biggest change in the last 5 decades comes from the decline in married households, down to 44%, and the rise in householders living alone, 20%, or with a partner, 8%. And so the answer to this demographic problem is overwhelmingly simpler than you might think. It entails making the act of raising a child a communally subsidized effort rather than the job of an atomized nuclear household. You know what they say, it takes a village to raise kids. This would involve giving families additional paid time off for new children, opening up more daycares and summer camps for kids to attend while their parents are away, subsidies for families with large numbers of children, and an expansion of what we define as family to extended relatives, friends, and neighbors, and those within our local community. Plus, the destigmatization of gay couples having and raising kids would also go a long way in helping with that effort. Does Cockshott agree with the solution? Well, sort of. While he is in favor of subsidies for working families and the elderly, he also proposes a bachelor tax to be placed upon households without dependents.
If you were to apply that nowadays, you'd have to set it at the labour value equivalent to the average annual hours that parents spend on unpaid childcare. In the US in 2005, this would have been 400 hours, roughly $13,000. And this would fall if more socialised childcare reduced the burden on mothers and fathers. And of course, the way to handle this in a social society is to have annual surveys of social.
All that I'm going to say about this is that people shouldn't be punished for not wanting to have kids. Maybe the Soviet Union needed to impose such draconian measures because they were coming back from a genocidal war that cost them tens of millions of lives, and these hard policies were needed to salvage Russia's perpetually shitty demographic situation. But we're living in different times and different conditions now. The global population is 7.7 billion and growing with no end in sight. And the aforementioned subsidizing and communalizing of child rearing would go a long way in mitigating any aforementioned demographic crisis. So I don't really think Cockshott's proposal is necessary or with the times. At last we arrive at the dreaded conclusion segment.
Broad-scale state support and encouragement is at its social basis as a middle class. Secondly, it's in no way a threat to capital. Doesn't cost anything. That's why it's funded by big capital and supported by the intelligence services. Now, obviously, socialist movements can use middle-class support, but they mustn't allow middle-class pressure groups to set policy or ideology. They mustn't be allowed to define progress in terms of their own special interests. And this is especially the case where the particular economic interests of these middle-class groups set them apart from the broad mass of the population.
I disagree for all of the aforementioned reasons. Not only should LGBT liberation be a primary focal point of our movement, we should be willing to let members of this community occupy important positions of leadership as well. In the same way that previously existing socialist projects went out of their way to accommodate the needs of women and ethnic minorities, so too should we, along with including all other uniquely oppressed classes under capitalism. Again, this whole income baiting shit he's doing right now is just weird to me, especially when, as stated before, the question is one of that of discrimination. Even if what he says is true about gay and lesbian households being more economically privileged, it doesn't disprove the real material discrimination that they still face on a regular basis. And if you thought that was bad, you better brace yourselves because it's about to get a whole lot more yikesy.
In it, which is growing. And it arises from the point that I was making earlier about there being a quite distinct socioeconomic position of gay male households compared to lesbian households. The rainbow movement is politically dominated by men, and men are the dominant sex class in society, and women are the subordinate or servile sex class. Within the rainbow movement, lesbians have an objectively distinct interest from those of the males, partly because they're in a different economic position, and secondly because they are subject to ideological pressure, threats of sexual violence, etc. And as such, radical lesbians are the main ally of socialists within the rainbow movement. And it's in the strategic interest of socialism that the rainbow movement be ideologically defeated and split, and we should support any movement of lesbians which encourages it to split.
Excuse me, what? So socialist orgs should single out radical lesbians for support and use them to effectively split the rainbow movement on arbitrary grounds that gay men are too influential within it? I apologize, but I do not know what to say in response to that. Cockshott is effectively calling for the wrecking of the LGBT movement when what we should be doing is building a bridge and a broader coalition with them. The idea that gay men are too influential and too privileged, therefore the rainbow movement needs to be split from them, is just patently absurd.
Now, some things should be so obvious, but in view of some comments that people have been making on the videos, the first point is that communists don't now advocate the criminalization of homosexual acts. The issue is one of political economy and has to be addressed by economic means. Now, the attitude of socialist governments or socialist states to rainbow front political organizations is quite another matter. The MI6 and CIA openly advocate using these for political subversion, so it would be quite understandable if governments in China or North Korea prohibited such organizations as being likely to be CIA fronts.
Actually, no, Cockshott. There is no sort of justification for actually existing socialist governments to restrict and prohibit LGBT rights activism on the grounds that they may or may not be CIA. And this is absolutely not a policy position that the modern socialist movement should have. This idea that LGBT political advocacy is inherently bourgeois subversion, and that there is a gay agenda being financed by the ruling class, and that under socialism it shouldn't be allowed. I mean, how is this just not bigotry? Sure, you're not saying that queer people should be discriminated against explicitly, but you're also saying that if and when such discrimination does exist, or there are unique issues facing this group, that queer people effectively shouldn't be allowed to advocate for their interests. It's important to understand that earlier iterations of socialism were a product of their time. Back in those days, people didn't know any better, as homosexuality and queerness have been misunderstood by many countries across the globe to be a mental illness, which is why in a lot of countries historically, and to this day, if one were to be outed as queer, they could be sent off to a psych ward, jailed, chemically castrated, or undergo forced gender reassignment. And the context in which many socialist revolutions occurred were within semi-feudal, underdeveloped, socially conservative backwaters in which most of the population were illiterate, superstitious peasants. Nobody had electricity or running water, and life expectancy was in the 30s. These were the conditions from which 20th century socialism emerged. But we're living in the 21st century now, and nowadays we should know better than this. Conditions of siege are no excuse for criminalizing homosexuality, and it is absolutely within the power of socialist governments both contemporarily and to this day whom were at siege to address the needs of the LGBT community in their respective countries. For example, after the socialists seized power in the Cuban Revolution, homosexuality was criminalized under Fidel Castro. However, in the preceding decades, following the Rainbow Movement which emerged in Cuba in the 1970s and 80s, homosexuality had been decriminalized. Gay rights were then recognized, and Castro would go on to issue a public apology for his formerly draconian measures. And so my point here is that if Cuba, a small island nation which exists off of the coast of the United States, one of the most sanctioned countries in the history of sanctions, whom are still very much at siege with the United States, if they can decriminalize homosexuality and embrace the rainbow movement without succumbing to bourgeois subversion or CIA fuckery, so too can future socialist governments, whether they are operating under conditions of siege or not. I'm going to finish off with some final points. Cockshott has frequently stated that because LGBT activist groups have ruling class support, that the CIA and MI6 have historically backed LGBT activism, that LGBT activism is by extension a psyop by the capitalists to subvert the left. It's akin to the kind of conspiracy-mongering right-wingers do when they say George Soros is funding Antifa or Black Lives Matter. But regardless, be it Black Lives Matter, anti-fascist action, the feminist movements, or the Extinction Rebellion, or even being a socialist YouTuber, no matter what social or economic issues that we are fighting for, the ruling class is always trying to subvert and entangle and entrench their interests within it. And this is part of what makes capitalism the most effective system of social control in the history of humanity. Through its corrupting influence, through its efforts to co-opt and commodify and commercialize these struggles, passionate young activists with real grievances are taken and funneled into political institutions, activist orgs, modes of thought, and other avenues which are tightly controlled by the ruling class designed to neutralize any and all revolutionary efforts which might threaten their profit margins and transmute these people into ABC moderate libs. In the aggregate, they defang the activists, driving them to impotency, hopelessness, and cynicism, transforming passionate young people into pragmatic, trademark, leftists, whom are completely ineffective at fighting the power and live under the illusion that their individual token activism or consumption habits is changing things when all they're actually doing is upholding the status quo. In this way, a left has been created that is easily malleable and manipulatable and controllable and intimidated. A left whose every step, whose every breath, whose every movement, no matter what path they take, no matter which direction they head, brings them straight back to capitalism. It's the reason why class politics have all but disappeared from the mainstream discourse. It's the reason why many leftists have no sense of solidarity or collective will. It's the reason why many leftists actively refuse scientific socialism and look to the only successful models of actually existing socialism with contempt. It's the reason why people think boycotts, voting with their wallets, and changing their consumption habits are actually going to affect anything material or have an impact. This is what capitalism does best. It tricks and manipulates people into thinking that they're making their own choices of their own conscious volition and free will, when all that they're really doing is subconsciously perpetuating ruling class hegemony. And the way that we combat this is not by tailing out-of-date socially conservative policies and ideas and outright rejecting these social issues on the grounds that they have been co-opted by the ruling class. Whether you like it or not, these social issues are working people's issues, and ABC liberalism and pragmatic leftism and all other opportunist trends are things that we are just going to have to contend with in our efforts for the simple fact that capitalism breeds opportunism. And so what we need to do is uphold the correct line and do everything in our power to combat this opportunism at all costs. We need to educate people and help them to understand these deceptions and what they're rooted in. We need to call out and expose the opportunists for what they are. And most importantly, we need to explain to people the mechanisms by which capitalism gives rise to bigotry and discrimination in the first place, and how the issues of racism, sexism, and homophobia intersect with class, and how the true liberation of humanity is contingent on the overturning of capitalism and the establishment of a new socialist system. This is how we inject class politics into the discourse. This is how we combat opportunism. This is how we build real socialist counter-hegemony, and this is how we bring people to the revolutionary path. As I've stated before, all we are doing in writing off movements like BLM and the LGBT is writing off working people's issues, because whether you like it or not, that is what they are. If you enjoy this content, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and if you would like to support me in more substantial ways than that, consider becoming a donor on Patreon for as little as $2 per month. Speaking of which, shout out to this month's patrons, the names of which are on screen. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. Alright, comrades, that's all I have to say for today. I hope it's been informative, and I will see you guys next time.